It is no secret that World of Warcraft NPCs do not play by the same rules as player characters do. On some level they have to, because it's easier to account for one NPC having some weird abilities than letting all the players run around with completely chaotic random abilities. Still, when you see someone like Thrall, who is very explicitly somewhere between warrior and shaman, or Anduin, who's definitely not a paladin, just a priest who wears plate and wields a sword, it makes you realize that there is a slightly deeper world beyond the limitations for the players. It shows us that characters in this world can do something that players have been asking for since pretty much the game started. Multiclassing. Multiclassing as a concept is older than all of Warcraft. It showed up in the early editions of D&D because someone must have asked, okay, but why can't I just learn to wield a sword? Why is my character bound to the one decision they made early on in their life? And it makes sense. In an actual world, a character would be able to learn multiple things. That said, in those early editions, multiclassing was extremely limited. Not just how many levels of which class you could pick up. Different races could only take so many levels in a given class. Like, seriously, reading these limitations now feels so crazy. Like, read this. A half-orc character can become a cleric, maximum of 4th level, a fighter, maximum of 10th level, a thief, maximum of 8th level, or an assassin, without level limitations here, apparently. It is also possible for a half-orc character to operate in 2 classes at the same time, cleric fighter, cleric thief, and so on and so on. All learned experience is always divided equally between the player's 2 classes, even though the character might no longer be able to progress to upwards in level in one of the 2 classes. Yeah, half your XP goes to the class you can no longer level up, because F you, that's why. By the way, you have freaking infravision and can see radiation from up to 60 feet away. This will come in handy when you need to find kryptonite later. Of course, a grand majority of these restrictions have been lifted since, in the many decades of D&D had to grow. Because, designers realized these do not make for very fun gameplay. Needless to say, doing something like this in a TTRPG is a much easier task than in an MMO. All you have to do is write it down and then make sure it's not broken in actual gameplay. When it comes to a video game, programming its rules and limitations takes, understandably, a lot of work, on top of the same design considerations. However, there are games out there that made it work. From games that are fairly faithful adaptations of TTRPG designs, such as the Pathfinder games or Baldur's Gate 3, to, more recently, subclassing in Elder Scrolls Online. Yeah, they called it subclassing. I don't know why. Maybe they wanted to be unique. Now it ends up sounding like something completely different. Anyway, last year, which is 2025 for people maybe watching this later, ESO introduced subclassing. In the Elder Scrolls tradition, ESO built their characters around skill lines. You'd level up class skills like Daedric Summoning for Sorcerer or Aedric Spear for Templar. And yeah, if you never played ESO but played mainline games, these classes and skills have very little to do with prior Elder Scrolls lore. But then, the game also has class-agnostic skills, such as weapon or armor skills, or lycanthropy, or scrying and excavation that are like BSO's archaeology that I think WoW could actually learn from. It makes for a bit of a compromise between the traditional Elder Scrolls skill-based systems and the class system they made up for this game. And now you can perform subclassing. After an intro questline, you can replace one of your class skill lines with a skill line from another class. So you could, in theory, be a Templar that replaces Restoring Light with Daedric Summoning. How you justify that for yourself is your problem. And then you can take Bone Tyrant skill from Necromancer to replace the third Templar skill for maximum sacrilege. These subclassed skill lines level up slower, buying their perks costs more skill points, and it all makes sense. It's fairly traditional that there are some limitations when you do something like multiclassing, or subclassing. What it does show us is that it's not impossible for MMOs to do multiclassing, even in a system that wasn't originally built for it. That said, World of Warcraft does run into some technical problems if it were to introduce a feature like this. One thing you might not have noticed is, for example, on the character list screen, it doesn't list your race, but only your class. Since like BFA, I think, a faction logo. But it does reveal something about the fundamental architecture of this game. WoW internally sees you primarily as your class. That's why class reroll has never been a feature, even though almost everything else about the character, including their race, can be re-customized. To WoW, your class is what you are. So how do we get around that? Partially in the same way ESO does. If you're that unholy Templar Sorcerer Necromancer hybrid, the game will always remember that you are Templar first, and you have to keep at least one skill line from the Templar class. So in WoW multiclassing, the game would still remember you are Paladin first. Perhaps the first 10 levels cannot be respect and must be kept to your original class, but from then on, while leveling or respecking, you can choose to instead have your current XP go to another class. I don't think slowing down your XP progression in WoW is necessary. With the way WoW is designed, it would mess with the leveling curve and lead to potentially weird situations like finishing all the questlines in a given expansion still not being max level, and being stuck grinding boars. However, once you earn that first level towards another class, you become level 1 at it. You gain the basic abilities the class gains at level 1, and you gain all their armor and weapon proficiencies and so on. So if you are a paladin who chooses to multiclass into hunter, you don't get new armor proficiencies, but you can now use guns and tame pets and have the most basic hunter abilities. This does mean that if you want to really get into the class and get their specializations and talents, you need to invest at least those 10 levels. And more importantly, it does mean that you don't get those levels in your original class. This does mean that you, in essence, lose access to the most powerful top level abilities for your original class, because you technically never reached level 90 in it. And if you took those hunter levels between, say, 70 and 80, getting that hunter specialization cost way more time and experience than it did for the original hunters. And some people may say, this is a problem. But really, this is fine, because that's the cost of doing business with multiclassing. Because believe me, even in D&D, you can use multiclassing to pull off some crazy OP combinations. One of the most infamous combinations is Assassin Rogue and Gloomstalker Ranger, which allows the player to pretty much delete at least one enemy in every encounter right away. And doing this system in WoW would also allow for some potentially crazy combinations. Imagine a paladin with reincarnation, which unlocks at level 8, or a mage who took a single level dip into warrior just to get plate armor, or anyone crazy enough to sacrifice 24 levels to a druid just to get flight form, just to be able to pick up herbs and flight instantly, or hunters taking 3 levels in rogue to be able to use stealth, or hell, everyone taking 3 levels in rogue to skip whole packs during MDI. Yes, these are all crazy combinations, and there's definitely way more that I didn't think of yet, but you have to remember it comes with the sacrifice of those highest level abilities of your main class. Is sacrificing 3 levels to gain stealth going to balance out against losing the top 3 talent points in your main class talent tree? If you're thinking it sounds like a balancing nightmare, then you'd be right, because it does. However, I do think that it's worth the effort to put into the game, because this feature would just be fun to play with. And sure, min-maxers would run it into the ground to find the most optimal class spec combination. But then again, they always do that anyway. They always optimize the fun out of their own game to get the biggest numbers possible. And meanwhile, the majority of players would just pick whatever combination they find the most fun, or whatever combination fits their RP most. There are some minor concerns to consider here, like should the multiclass have access to specializations and talent trees? And I say yes, or what you'd be getting out of a class would be negligible. Should they have access to the multiclasses hero talents? Perhaps not. These sound like they should be reserved for characters devoted to their original class. That's not to say to not let the original class pick up their original hero talents, but maybe just stick to them to enhance their original identity. And there is the concern of race class limitations, like can a Pandaren warrior multiclass into paladin? If they do, what happens to the racially themed cosmetics? I can see Blizzard limiting this so that you still have to adhere to your original racial limitations, but personally I think the time of class-race combo limitations is over, and the only thing really holding us back is the artistic side of those themed cosmetics. And in the case of multiclass, I can see a race multiclassing into a class they normally don't have, just get basic, so read usually human or orc, themes, which I think is a tolerable sacrifice. Well, I think that's enough out of me for today. What multiclass combos would you like to pull off? Would you put in just a few levels to gain some very specific ability out of another class? Or would you do this for RP to better fit your paladin, who was always meant to have a pet he fights with? Please do let me know in the comments below, because I'd love to hear about the things people would do with this system. This is exactly the kind of stuff I like to hear from the community. Meanwhile, after this, I might take a small break at least from the future WoW classes and class-based systems. Not because the rude people in the comments successfully bullied me out of doing something creative, but because I do recall my original goals when I first created my Warcraft reboot for my TTRPG. One of my main directives was design for what you actually have instead of for what you wish you could have. Don't design WoW expansions, because you will never be able to make one. Because WoW Edit is not publicly available, and Blizzard will not hire you from across the ocean. People did watch these videos, and they were my most watched videos recently, so I kept doing them to give people what they apparently want. But I want to refocus on designing for what I do have, on designing for a TTRPG. And there is something there that I am excited to share with you next week, and maybe even more, maybe some things that you would find useful even for your D&D playthroughs, related to that other project. But more on that when the right time comes. I am also on Fiverr now, offering to write your RPG character backstories for a small fee, perhaps soon to offer Atlas-style maps for your fantasy worlds. If you would be interested in that, please do check out the links in the comments below. Meanwhile, this is it for today, and I hope to see you next time.